Hello, everyone. My name is Raymond Lotta. I'm a spokesperson for Revolution Books here in New York City. And I see new faces in the audience. I see longstanding friends, and there are people watching nationally on the live stream. And to all of you, a warm welcome to Revolution Books and tonight's program. I want to say just a few words about Revolution Books. This is a unique bookstore. It is the political, intellectual, and cultural center for a movement for an actual revolution to overthrow this system and bring into being a society and world in which human beings can truly flourish. Here, this is a place that values critical thinking, the poetic spirit, and the search for the truth. You find the breadth of books and discussion to engage the biggest questions confronting humanity, from the police murder of Black and brown people to the climate catastrophe. And the beating heart of this bookstore is the work and leadership of Bob Avakian. Bob Avakian has developed a whole new framework for human emancipation, the new communism. And Bob Avakian has pointed out that if there is going to be fundamental change for the better, one of the key things that people need to learn about is the actual history of this country and its role in the world as the greatest oppressor on this planet. So it's only fitting that tonight we have this special program on the Tulsa Massacre, the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre. And here you will find the books, the resources, and the programs, such as tonight, to dig in to this history and to the actual role that the United States plays in the world. So again, I want to welcome everyone to our program tonight. And with this, I want to hand the mic over to Emma Kaplan, who speaks for the Revolution Club in New York. So here's Emma to introduce Carl and tonight's program.
All right, thank you, Raymond. I want to welcome everybody tonight to this special program. 100 years since the Tulsa Massacre, these racist horrors must end. Get organized now for a real revolution. Major talk by Carl Dix. And so we're going to start with, first, before we hear from Carl, we're going to start with a short documentary produced by David Zeiger, and it's featured as part of the Revolution Nothing Less show, which is a show that is organizing nationally in a movement for revolution. You can subscribe at YouTube/the RevComs. And it's a very moving documentary. And then you're going to hear from Carl. And then we're going to have a discussion. And you're also going to hear from the New York City Revolution Club on how you can join this movement to organize now for this revolution. So with no more ado, let's go ahead and get the film.
Okay, here's a pop quiz. What was the site of the biggest race riot in the history of this country?
Oklahoma, where the wind comes sweeping down the plain.
That's right, the great state of Oklahoma, home of lovable farmers and ranchers who just need to learn how to be friends and share all those wide open spaces. In the decades following the Civil War, Oklahoma was the destination for both white settlers and former slaves looking to build a new life. It was also the final destination of the Trail of Tears, the forced march of the southeastern Native American tribes, but that's another American crime story. When Oklahoma became a state in 1907, the very first law they passed legalized and enforced racial segregation. After all, they had to make it a real American state. Tulsa, then, was a sleepy town of 10,000. But with the discovery of oil 3 years later, the population grew to over 100,000 in just 1 decade. Among those were thousands of Black people looking for a better life and hoping to escape the worst of Jim Crow Mississippi, Georgia, and other states of the Old South. In 1921, Tulsa was strictly segregated. Black people could work in town, but all black residents were required to live and shop in the Greenwood district of northern Tulsa. Greenwood's segregated economy, self-contained and self-sufficient, was so successful that it became known nationally as the Black Wall Street. Black-owned grocery stores, banks, libraries, hotels, restaurants, movie theaters, and more lined Greenwood Avenue. But here's what happened on May 30th, 1921. Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner working downtown, enters the elevator of the only building with a restroom that blacks can use in the area. Sarah Page, a white 17-year-old, is the elevator operator. When the door closes, Page cries out, and Rowland, who may have just tripped and stepped on her foot, runs off, knowing what can happen. Sure enough, he's alleged, without evidence, to have assaulted Page. He's arrested the next morning and held in a jail cell above City Hall. Then the headlines hit. The Tulsa Tribune declares nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator, and headlines an editorial, quote, "To lynch Negro tonight," end quote. Within an hour, a lynch mob in the hundreds descends on the courthouse. Word spreads throughout Greenwood that whites are storming the courthouse, and Rowland is in danger. At 9 p.m., a group of 25 armed black men, some World War I veterans, drive to the courthouse determined to stop the lynching. The local authorities refuse their offer to help, and they leave. But the heavily armed white mob is incensed. When a group of 75 black men return to the courthouse and are again turned away, a white man approaches an armed black Army veteran and demands he turn over his gun. A fight breaks out, and a gun goes off. Historian and author Scott Ellsworth wrote, "While the first shot fired at the courthouse may have been unintentional, those that followed were not. Almost immediately, members of the white mob, and possibly some law enforcement officers, opened fire on the African-American men, who returned volleys of their own. The initial gunplay lasted only a few seconds, but when it was over, as many as a dozen men, both black and white, lay dead or wounded. Outnumbered more than 20 to 1, the black men began a retreating fight toward the African-American district, with armed whites in close pursuit. They tried to kill all the black folks they could see," a survivor, George Monroe, recalled later. As many as 500 white men and boys are immediately sworn in as, quote, "special deputies," end quote, and told to, quote, "get a gun and get a nigger," end quote. Deputies pass out weapons from a sporting goods store across the street. White rioters begin firing on blacks and setting fire to black-owned homes and businesses late into the night. Then as dawn approaches, literally thousands of armed whites, some estimated as many as 10,000, gathered in 3 locations on the edges of Greenwood. A siren sounds at daybreak, and the mobs of white terrorists launch their invasion. These armed white mobs include over 150 Tulsa police. They set about systematically killing, looting, and burning the entire district of Greenwood, block by block. Armed whites break into black homes and businesses and force the people outside, where they are led away at gunpoint to internment centers set up by the authorities. Anyone who resists is shot. If guns are found inside, the occupant is shot. Homes and businesses are looted, then set on fire with torches and oil-soaked rag. House by house, block by block, Greenwood is demolished. Even airplanes are used to shoot black people from the air and drop kerosene bombs on buildings, setting them ablaze. Tremendously outnumbered, black Tulsans fight back. Riflemen take positions atop the belfry of a newly built church to try and halt the white invasion. But the church is burned to the ground. Deputized police and the National Guard units arrest 6,000 Greenwood residents. Black Tulsans don't go down without a fight, but they're outgunned and outnumbered. Survivors recounted black bodies loaded on trains and dumped off bridges into the Arkansas River, and, most frequently, tossed into mass graves. By noon on June 1st, these white mobs had murdered more than 300 black Tulsa residents. They had turned 40 square blocks of Greenwood into a scorched wasteland, including 1,256 homes destroyed, along with virtually every other structure, churches, schools, businesses, even a hospital and library. More than 10,000 residents were left homeless. Thousands of Black Tulsans spent the winter living in tents, many left for good, having had enough of Tulsa, Oklahoma. A grand jury investigation organized by Oklahoma's governor in the days after the massacre referred to the events in Tulsa as a, quote, Negro uprising, end quote, concluding, quote, the assembly was quiet until the arrival of armed Negroes, which precipitated and was the direct cause of the entire affair, end quote. But that ain't all, folks.
It sure smells sweet, but the wind blows right behind the rain.
The Tulsa race riot was erased from the state and country's history for 76 years. It wasn't until 1997 that a commission was established in Oklahoma to study the riot. And what did they find? Quote, not one of these criminal acts was then or ever has been prosecuted or punished by government at any level, municipal, county, state, or federal.
So watching that is extremely heavy, and I am honored to introduce Carl Dix to actually lay some foundation and some history on this, but more importantly, to call for the reason and to really get into what we got to do to stop things like this, to stop shit like this from happening over and over and over again. From the massacres like Tulsa, to the hundreds that took place outside of Tulsa, up until this year and last year with George Floyd. Carl Dix is an advocate of the new communism developed by Bob Avakian. And he's part of the National Get Organized for an Actual Revolution tour. He's a founding member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, a co-initiator with Cornel West of the Stop Mass Incarceration Network, and a co-initiator of Refuse Fascism. Carl has been on the front lines of struggle against white supremacy and fascism from Charlottesville in August 2017 to January 2020 and the armed fascist lobby day in Richmond, to the streets of Minneapolis, St. Paul in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. During the 70s, Carl spent 2 years in Leavenworth Military Penitentiary for refusing to go to Vietnam. I met Carl around 2010 as part of a series of nonviolent civil disobedience actions to stop the stop and frisk policy. And I'll never forget the impact of marching around Harlem, actually with people here, to take on the police that had oppressed and brutalized, harassed, where this had been the daily condition of people here. But to take that fight on and actually not only go to that precinct, but precincts all over New York City, and actually take this on as part of a national fight to take on mass incarceration. He's someone that profoundly impacted what I thought was possible when it came to how you could actually fight this system and win. Someone who's been profoundly inspired and has taken leadership from the work of Bob Avakian. And so I'm honored to introduce him, to introduce his work to you guys tonight, right? And for you all to be impacted by what he's saying tonight, not just about Tulsa, but about the movement for revolution that we need to organize for and that we're in the midst of organizing for right now. So without further ado, let's give it up for Carl Dix. Oh, and you can find him on social media. He's active on Twitter at Carl_Dix. All right.
I think I have a mic that's gonna work. I'm gonna pull this off and get busy. And you might wanna silence your phones because You don't want to miss this. Let me just say that. Let me get started. I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams, she said. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot. This is a quote from Viola Fletcher. Sister is 107 years old, a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and this quote is from the testimony that she gave before Congress this past May. And let me just start here. This history must not be forgotten. Everyone with a heart for humanity, everyone who is, as the declaration and call from the RevCom says, can't stand the world the way it is, and who are sick and tired of seeing so many people being treated as less than human, cannot forget this history and cannot allow it to be wiped away. I want to begin my remarks tonight by reading the following short statement from Bob Avakian, the leader of the movement for an actual revolution, on the Tulsa Massacre. The Racist Tulsa Massacre, the Most Profound Lesson, by Bob Avakian. This year is the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre in 1921, in which armed mobs of racist white people, including many police in Tulsa, Oklahoma, slaughtered hundreds of black people, terrorized thousands, and burned down a thriving black community with its churches, hospitals, homes, schools, libraries, and businesses. And this kind of murderous oppression is still going on in many horrific ways under the rule of this system in this country and worldwide. Case closed. This system from the start and right down to today is guilty of the most atrocious crimes against humanity. It will never stop doing this. It can never stop, so long as it is in power and in effect. That is a lesson we must firmly grasp and act on. The question is not whether this system of capitalism, imperialism needs to go, but how soon can it be swept away by the revolutionary struggle of millions of people who are sickened and outraged by the reality that things like the Tulsa Massacre are not some kind of exception, but the rule. A concentration of what this system is all about and how it treats masses of people, not only in this country, but all over the world. Bob Avakian, as I said, is the leader of the movement for an actual revolution. Raymond referred to him. He's the architect of the new communism, a new framework for human emancipation, a leader who has figured out how to make revolution in a country like this. I'm going to talk more about that later. I just wanted to let you know who he is and that I'm a follower of his. I'm a follower of his because I want to get free. You saw the short film. You saw breaking down how people were slaughtered, how people, thousands, were marched into internment camps, how 40 square blocks of a thriving black community was destroyed. You also saw the headline, "Nab Negro for assault of white woman." There was another headline which was mentioned but not put up on the screen in the newspaper, "To lynch Negro tonight." This wasn't some spontaneous thing. This was something that the authorities in Tulsa put the call out for. And then they followed that up by not prosecuting any of the people who carried out this slaughter, this destruction, this mass theft. Because this was an attack that had genocidal, dimensions. And if you doubt that or want to get clearer on that, we can talk about that in the discussion. Nobody was ever prosecuted. No restitution was ever brought forward. And the survivors of this massacre, their descendants and supporters, have been calling for punishment for the perpetrators of this. They've demanded restitution and restoration, and they were denied at every step along the way. Insurance companies refused to honor any of the policies that any of the businesses had with them. They just said, we ain't paying it, forget it. And they did erase this from history. People who grew up in Tulsa have told me that they learned about this massacre after they left Tulsa, went away to college. That's when they found out what had happened in the city that they grew up in. They were so intent on erasing the history of this that when they microfilmed the newspaper, because that's a thing that they started doing to preserve the historical record. They put them on microfilm and then you can find them in the library and all like that. They took the front page that said Negro nabbed in arrest for the assault on a white woman and to lynch Negro tonight. Those pages were missing. They're not on the microfilm. That's how intent they were on erasing this. Now, the Tulsa Massacre is horrific. It was the largest massacre of Black people in this country, the largest racial massacre in this country. But it is not an extreme, isolated example of the oppression that this system has inflicted on Black people. It's not an isolated case. Instead, it's part of a long, unending chain of savagery this country has inflicted on the African American people. And let's walk through that. If you say, Carl, why are you hyping it up? I ain't hyping nothing up. If anything, I'm understating it. And let's talk about this reality. And then you tell me that I'm overstating it, that I'm talking about stuff that didn't really happen. Look at World War I when this happened. After World War I when this happened, there were waves of attacks like this. In 1919, over 36 areas across the country, there were mob attacks on Black people by white mobs, ranging from major cities like Chicago, even down to rural areas in Arkansas. Black people were murdered. Black people had their property taken, destroyed. People were put in concentration camps. What was the reason for this? It was things like Black sharecroppers in a place in Arkansas hired a white lawyer to represent them in their negotiations with the plantation owners because they knew they were getting robbed. And they think we get a white lawyer up in here, maybe we'll actually get what we are owed for the cotton that we're producing. That was deemed an act of insurrection. That's how they was looking at this stuff. Now, after 1919, the shit was so widespread and so foul that the leaders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People dubbed that period the Red Summer of 1919. Many of these attacks were also met with armed Black resistance, like in Tulsa. Much of it spearheaded by Black veterans who had fought in World War I. Men who'd been sent to Europe to fight to defend democracy came back and realized we ain't got none. We can fight for democracy over here. Maybe we need to fight for some rights on this side of the water. But it didn't just start there. We can step back. Before these attacks, there were centuries of Black people being held in slave chains, forced through whipping and other forms of torture to work from can't see in the morning till can't see at night, building up the wealth and power of the growing American empire. That's part of that long, unending chain of oppression. It runs through massacres that were perpetrated after slavery, after the Civil War, when slavery was officially abolished. But white mobs again were unleashed to attack newly freed black people, to keep them suppressed, to keep them from exercising their rights. This chain runs through thousands of lynchings, decades of Ku Klux Klan terror and Jim Crow laws that suppressed black people and kept white supremacy in effect. Black people and those who stood with them have met these attacks with fierce resistance. We could start with the slave rebellions, the Underground Railroad. We could look at the 175,000 black soldiers who joined the Union Army during the Civil War, who fought to end slavery. We could take it up through the resistance that continued against the Jim Crow laws, against the lynch mob terror, Jim Crow segregation. This history of attacks and fierce resistance is not just a historical thing. It continues right down to today. Look around you: police murder, mass incarceration that disproportionately targets black and brown people, huge disparities in income, in wealth, in education, in housing, and a number of other fronts between blacks and whites. All this continues despite decades of resistance, ranging from the uprisings in the 1960s down to the millions of people who poured into the streets last year calling for justice for George Floyd and an end to white supremacy. But with all this resistance, even as all this goes down, the attacks continue. They don't let up a bit. Out of all this, we can identify an ugly truth and then draw an important lesson. The ugly truth is, to quote from this pamphlet, Bob Avakian, For the Liberation of Black People and for the Emancipation of All Humanity. Here's what it says: for the powers that be in this country, the humanity of black people has never counted for anything. They have never been valued as human beings, but only as things to be exploited, oppressed, and repressed. And the important lesson that we must draw is that the oppression of black people and the white supremacy that drives it are built into the fabric of the capitalist imperialist system we live under. There's a historically evolved toxic combination between white supremacy and the capitalist imperialist system. This system cannot and will not end this racial oppression. This oppression must be ended, and it can be ended, but not under this system. Ending this oppression and uprooting white supremacy can only be done through a real revolution to abolish this system. Now, I'm going to be talking about revolution here tonight. So let me break down what that means. A real revolution means organizing millions of people and leading them to rise up and overthrow the system, to meet and defeat its institutions of violent suppression, and then to go on after that to build a totally different and far better system in its place. One that puts the power to run society into the hands of the people, led by their revolutionary communist vanguard. A society that has an economy based on collective ownership of the means to produce wealth, the factories, the farms, the mines, and other institutions. And a society that has different ways for people to relate to each other. Trying to achieve change within the confines of this system is to put yourself on a no-win road. It can't happen. Look, the Democrats have got no answer to the horrors their system continues to bring down, and the Democrats are a representative of this system. Don't be confused. Don't think that they're a party that's out there for the people or for oppressed people or black people. They're a party representing this system, and they got no answer to the problems this system causes. Despite the talk that started coming out after the conviction of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd, people were saying, well, we've turned the corner on dealing with abusive policing. Biden started talking about this George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, something like that. I might have the name a little bit wrong. The actual reality and what we need to get is that even as they were putting Chauvin on trial, police continued to brutalize and murder black people and get away with it. While the jury deliberated, police continued to murder black people and get away with it. After Chauvin was taken off in handcuffs and marched to the prison, police continued to brutalize and murder black people and get away with it. The laws that Biden and the Democrats have proposed to reform policing and deal with the other attacks on the system, they don't get to the roots of the problem. They don't get to it. And they're not going to get past the Republican opposition anyway. So they're not going to happen, but you're getting behind them. You're getting behind something that's not going to change anything. I read the abstract of the George Floyd Reform Act in policing before coming here tonight. I'm looking through it and saying, well, maybe there is something in there that's going to stop police from murdering black people. This act bans chokeholds. New York City banned chokeholds by the police years ago, well before the police choked Eric Garner to death. Did that cop who choked Eric Garner to death get any punishment for doing that? And you can't say he didn't do it because he was right there doing it. It was on TV. It got videoed. It went around the world. That's what banning chokeholds will do, by the police will do for you. It just means the police going to do it anyway. And then say, you didn't see me choke that dude. He had heart trouble. He was overweight. He was in poor health. That's all that comes down to. Now, Joe Biden, he's talking about, I got inequality square in my sights. I'm going to do something about it. But when this man really waxes nostalgic, it's when he's talking about healing the soul of America, unifying the country, and reaching across the aisle to get both parties working together on dealing with the country's problems. Well, let's start on that from the end. When he talks about reaching across the aisle, on one side of the aisle, you got a party that's full of fascists, a party that is out to intensify all of the horrors this system brings down, and even to change the way things are decided in this system. You saw what they was doing in January, and that was to say, forget about this election that we lost. We need to stay in power. Now they're passing laws around voting to try to make that happen, whether they win an election or not. This is who these folks are. They're passing those laws. They're passing laws to criminalize protests and all the rest of it. So working together with them is not going to get anything done that's in the interest of the people. And this is a country that built its wealth and power on what? Slavery, genocide against the native inhabitants, and continued true to the values that drove that from the very beginning down to today. So politicians and pundits who get up there and every time there's an atrocity like mass murder of Asians, hate crime attacks, Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck and snuffing the life out of him, they rush out here to say, this is not who we are. This does not reflect the values of America. Bullshit. This is the values of America. These are the values that this empire has been true to from the very beginning. And if you're trying to maintain the values and heal the soul of this country, what has that soul shown you about it? What does that soul show you? Ain't nothing good gonna come that way. And uniting the country, which means bringing together the fascists and the liberal imperialists and all the people they can get to follow them, that is not in the interest of oppressed people. It's not in the interest of black people. It's not in the interest of humanity. See, and let me just say a little bit about the fascists who were rallied and unleashed by the Trump-Pence regime and who tried to overturn the results of the 2020 election. They have not gone away. They will not go away. They have a program for dealing with black people, and they are carrying it out right now, attacking voting rights, attacking the right to protest, demonizing the Black Lives Matter movement. And they're proposing laws and policies that ban even teaching about the history of savage oppression of this country. That's not to be allowed. They promote instead patriotic education that teaches people to love this country, which then comes down to loving the horrors that it's carried out and being ready to throw down, to commit more of those horrors, to keep it in effect. The Democrats and the Republic-fascists, because that's what they are, they're not Republicans, they Republic-fascists, are fighting. They're fighting tooth and nail against each other at the top of the society. But this is a fight over how to keep America's empire dominant in the world. The masses of people ain't got a dog in that fight between the Democrats and the Republicans. This is a struggle over what's best to keep global domination by the American empire in effect and to keep down anybody who might challenge this. The Democrats are slyer about it than the Republicans, but it comes down to the same thing. Instead of getting behind the Democrats and hoping they'll represent our interests or trying to push them to pass more progressive laws and enact more progressive policies, anybody who wants to see the horrific oppression of black people and any of the other horrors this system perpetrates, from the attacks on our immigrant sisters and brothers, the attacks on women and taking away their rights, the destruction of the very planet we live under, and all the rest, you need to get with a movement for a real revolution that can get rid of this system once and for all, because that's the only way to stop those horrors. Now, this struggle that I've been talking about at the top of this system, it's playing an important role that we have to recognize. And that is, it's intensifying the vulnerability of the system and opening up greater possibilities for making revolution. And to flesh that out a little bit for you, I'm going to read from a declaration and call to get organized now for a real revolution issued by the RevComs. In point 2, it says, revolutions are not possible all the time, but are generally possible only in rare times and circumstances, especially in a powerful country like this. This is one of those rare times and circumstances. The system is in real trouble, caught up in crisis and conflicts for which it has no easy or lasting solutions. Throughout this country, the workings of this system have given rise to deep divisions, which cannot be resolved under this system. Society is being ripped apart. Those who rule are locked in a bitter fight amongst themselves, and they cannot hold things together in the way that they have in the past. Although there are a lot of bad things connected with this, and it could lead to something really terrible, it is also possible that we could wrench something really positive out of it. Revolution, to put an end to this system and bring something much better into being. And then the declaration goes on to talk about the potential that we have seen in recent months, going back into last year, for making advances in enlisting people in this kind of revolution. We have seen the potential for revolution powerfully demonstrated just last summer, when millions of people of all races and genders all over the country and all around the world rose up together against racist oppression and police murder. We have seen this potential in mass outpourings of women in countries all over the world refusing to put up with being abused and degraded. The potential is also revealed in the deep distress being expressed by scientists and millions of ordinary people about the continually worsening climate crisis and the threat this poses to the future of humanity. And what this does is this underscores the need to accelerate work to get ready and in position to make revolution. It underscores the need to wake people up to the need for and the possibility of revolution, and to connect them with the leader that we have for this revolution, Bob Avakian, the architect of a new framework for human emancipation, the new communism. Now, Avakian is a rare leader, one who's thrown his life into making revolution to emancipate humanity, a leader who has a heart for the people and is able to break down how to overcome the obstacles that will be confronted in making revolution to get rid of this system and building a totally different and far better one in its place, so that it can be accessible to the basic people. There's never been a leader like Bob Avakian in this country. And I say that as someone who was inspired to join the revolution back in the 1960s by Malcolm X and the leaders of the Black Panther Party. Because look, those leaders were determined, they were courageous, they put their lives on the line, and a number of them gave their lives in this fight. But what these leaders were not able to do was to develop the strategy for how to make a revolution in a country like this, or to develop a vision of the future society that could be brought into being through revolution. And these are things that Avakian has done. He's authored a constitution for the new socialist republic in North America that gets into what the society would be like the day after the revolution, and how it would transform to becoming a society where oppression and exploitation is being done away with. He's also got a talk, which you can find on the website revcom.us, that's entitled Why We Need an Actual Revolution and How We Can Really Make Revolution. People who want to get free need to get to know this man. They need to engage his work and dig into it. All of this is why I'm a follower of Bob Avakian, and why, if you want to see the horrors this system perpetrates on humanity ended, you need to follow him too. And yes, I'm saying that you should follow an old white man. Because Avakian, he'd been around long as I have. I ain't gonna get into how old I am, but I was back in the 1960s. I refused to go to Vietnam. That gives you an idea about how old I am. I'm saying you got to follow him because this is a man who's figured out how to make revolution, how to bring into being a world where exploitation and oppression is no more, a classless communist world. So if you're serious about wanting to see something done about the suffering today, then you got to be serious enough to get scientific on it. You got to see that the criteria for leadership isn't what race somebody is, or what gender they are, how old they are, or anything like that. The criteria is who has done the work to point the way towards revolution, who can make that work accessible to more people, and who can lead numbers of people in acting on that. You got to engage the work that Bob Avakian, we call him BA, has done, and you have to take it up and act on it and spread the need and possibility of revolution and let people know about the leader we have for this necessary revolution. Look, we got some important things going for us in carrying out this approach to getting in position to make revolution when the time to do that comes about. But we face a very big problem, which is that too few people even know about this revolution, and nowhere near enough people are with it yet. So we have to go to work. We have to go to work right now on changing this situation. To get into that some more, I want to quote again from the declaration and call to get organized now for a real revolution issued by the RevComs. We need to get this revolution and its leadership known everywhere. We need to challenge and seriously struggle with people right around us and all over the country to do something that, yes, requires real heart and will make a positive difference. Become part of this revolution and follow this revolutionary leadership. We need to organize more and more people into the ranks of the revolution. And by the way, this declaration is something else that you need to get your hands on if you want to see people get free. And a way to do that is to go to the website revcom.us. Now, an important step in accelerating the development of this movement for revolution is going to be taken on June 12th. That's when the Revolution Club in Los Angeles and the Revolution Club here in NYC will take to the streets. Here in New York, going to take to the streets right up here in Harlem. And we're doing that to show the world that we are getting organized now for revolution, nothing less. The revolution clubs and those who march with them will go to hated symbols of the oppression this system brings down on the people, and they will declare, for the masses of people and ultimately for humanity as a whole, there is no future and no future worth living under this system. But there is a way to a world and a future that is worth fighting for right now. Revolution, a real revolution, not playing around with a few changes that leave this system in power and in place while benefiting only a small number of people. That's what the RevComs and the Revolution Club will be declaring when they do this march on June 12th. Now look, everybody who can't stand the way this world is should join in this march on June 12th. And for those who ain't able to march, because I know some people, not me of course, but there's some people, you know, their age is too advanced for them to be out in the streets, so they might not be able to get out there and march. Well, you got to do all you can to support it, to help promote it, help the word get out. Donate money to help support this happening. And the New York City Revolution Club, they in the house tonight. You've heard a couple of them, Emma and Jamel. They're going to tell you more about the June 12th march that's going to go down here in Harlem and in Los Angeles. Let me go back to why we're here tonight, 100 years since the Tulsa Massacre. This was the largest assault against Black people in the history of this country. And it was genocidal in his thrust. And again, I'm somebody who uses my words wisely and well. So when I say something is genocide, I'm not trying to hype it up. I'm telling you about how it actually was. And this massacre is a concentration of the actual history of this country, a history full of such attacks against Black people. Now, as Bob Avakian said in the statement I read near the beginning of this talk, this system from the start and right down to today is guilty of the most atrocious crimes against humanity. It will never stop doing this. It can never stop, so long as it is in power. It will never stop doing this, so long as it's in power and in effect. That is a lesson that we need to firmly grasp and act on. The question is not whether this system of capitalism, imperialism needs to go, but how soon can it be swept away by the revolutionary struggle of millions of people who are sickened and outraged by the reality. That's right. People who are sickened and outraged by the reality that things like the Tulsa Massacre are not some kind of exception, but the rule. A concentration of what this system is all about and how it treats masses of people, not only in this country, but all over the world. Now, in closing, I want to cite something that was said by another survivor of the Tulsa Massacre. This is Hughes Van Ellis. He also spoke before Congress last month. Van Ellis, after surviving this massacre, joined the U.S. Army, fought in its wars, but he also strove for justice all of his life. He's over 100 years old now. Here's what he had to say. He said, "Let me not leave this earth without justice." And he referred to all of the other survivors, almost all of whom have died and left this earth without justice. For him, for the other survivors of the massacre, and for all those who were slaughtered in Tulsa over those 2 days 100 years ago. And in fact, for all of humanity, we need to act on the lessons from this massacre and work to get rid of the system responsible for it and for many other horrors as soon as possible, and do it in the only way that is really possible, through a real revolution. So that's what I have to say, sisters and brothers. I believe the Revolution Club is going to step back up, because it has a bit to say to you.
All right. Could I get some of the New York City Revolution Club members to join me up here? Okay. All right, so we are the New York City Revolution Club, and June 12th, we are calling on you to march with us to the New York City Police Department, the modern-day lynch mob. I'm going to take this off. The modern-day lynch mob, who have for so long choked, murdered, brutalized, humiliated, degraded Black people over and over and over again. And we are going to march in the streets of Harlem. And we are going to call on everyone who is sick and tired of seeing people being treated as less than human. Everyone who doesn't want to live under this oppressive system one moment longer. And we are going to make a declaration. We are getting organized for a real revolution. And we're calling on you in this audience, and people watching, and a lot of other people who feel the same way we do, to march with us, march with the Revolution Club. If you want to see an end, if you are serious about wanting to see an end to these horrors and all the other horrors this system brings down on people here and all over the world, if you want to have a sense of your own power, our collective power together, and help other people find their own power to end these horrors, march with the New York City Revolution Club. We are going to go out there. We are going to inspire. We are going to challenge. We are going to provoke all the people who think that we have to just live with this. The world can't change, and this is just the way that it is. And we're going to show them their potential to make a real revolution in this country, bring down the system, and bring a radically different and far better world into being. That's why you should march with the New York City Revolution Club on June 12th. And we have a lot of work to do to make this happen. So 2 p.m. we're going to start at Marcus Garvey Park, and then we're going to take the streets in Harlem going all the way up to the 28th precinct. But we need you to go to work with us on spreading the word about this demonstration, on letting people know about it, and also helping us to work on the biggest problems with that confront the revolution. For example, we need to get a lot more young people up in this movement. And we have to figure out together, how do we get some of the youth who are not into some good stuff, who are fighting and dying over nothing, to fight and live for something really worth fighting for? And so we need you. This revolution needs you. We need you in this fight. Who do we need?
You.
Who do we need? Us. All right. So there's ways to be involved right now, tonight. Get flyers, get posters. They're on that table. Cover your neighborhood with them. Get it on a mission like humanity depends on it, because it absolutely does. Tomorrow, the day after that, the day after that, the day after that, we're going to be going and covering all of Harlem. So you can come here to Revolution Books anytime, 2 p.m. tomorrow. You want to come out and come run with the Revolution crew, we'll be here. If you want to come in the evening and strategize with us, where do we need to go, what radio stations we need to get to, where on social media we need to be, we need your ideas, we need your thinking. And then Saturday, right here, we want a mass neighborhood meeting out on that sidewalk to really figure out how we push that last week. And so you can follow us at NYC Rev Club, and after the discussion with your questions to Carl, talk to one of us in the Revolution Club, and also join the Revolution Club. So that's it.
I got my mic.
Okay.
Okay, so now it's time for one of my favorite parts of programs like this. Time for us to chop it up, to get into it. What do you think? What do you think about what I laid out? What do you think about what I may have not said? What questions do you have? What comments do you want to make? And that holds for both people here and people who are in the live stream audience. Okay, so we got, there's somebody doing a mic.
Hello. One of the things, like just watching the video and just listening to the speakers and whatnot today, 1919 and like 2020, is devastating years in regards to this particular population, on this continent. It's on the cages to like Palestine, being like torn apart, to COVID and whatnot. It's about us like protecting ourselves and one another. Like it's a stark reminder that it's possible for 40 square blocks to be wiped clean. If the hardware is pointing in the wrong direction, you know what I mean? Defense is key and whatnot, to make sure that our communities don't get torn up, by things that, are loud or by things that are quiet, like, regardless if it's clean water, Flint, regardless if it's like, preventing, black churches and mosques and synagogues from blowing up, you know what I mean? Like, the answer to white fragility and white terrorism is bravery. But like, it's a stark reminder, they fought to the man. Like some of those Tuskegee veterans, they're looking at those planes like that might have been like, they knew how to fly that shit. They flew that shit right over their heads and shit like that. Like if they could just get to one of their planes, I mean, I can only imagine, just watch him go, like, to the man. But try not to let it go off, but we got to protect our future generations. You know what I mean? That I'm out.
Okay, and let me just note the way the brother was very wide ranging in terms of what we're up against, because I didn't get into the water crisis around Flint, but that's real. And that's not just happening in Flint, where they're pumping poison into the house through the water that runs.
Environmental racism.
And they even got you paying for the poison that they pumping into your house and all of this. And we do have to look at how are we going to stop this. But again, that comes down to revolution. We got to get rid of a system that does this again and again and again and again and again. And revolution is really the only way to do that. We have someone over there, and then I have then I have a question or two from the live stream.
You mentioned that a lot of this history was intentionally erased. So what I would like to know is, how did the story of this survive? Obviously, there were survivors, but I remember like last year I came here and I bought like 2 books on the Tulsa genocide. So how is it that the story of this managed to survive? You know what I mean? Besides survival testimonials, where there are archival footage, even dug deep, like, was it orally passed down through generations? Was it replayed in Black church testimonials? Like, How did we end up with this much information beyond survivor testimonials in this day and age, enough to get books published on this?
Okay, that's a good question, because they did make an attempt to erase it from history. And many people understood, including people who survived, that they better not talk about it if they wanted to stay safe. Because I made the reference to people who grew up in Tulsa and didn't know about it. Some of them were Black people whose older relatives had experienced the massacre, but didn't tell them about it. But when it happened, it was in the news all across the country from the perspective of this was a good thing. Right. These Black insurrectionists were put back under control. So some people learned about it that way. Then it was like really word of mouth, because there was not a lot out there around it. And by word of mouth, it spread. More people began to learn about it. And then you had things like the 1960s, where as part of the uprising, there was a move to study Black history. And then things like this began to get dug into, began to be learned about, began to be spread, but it was not widespread enough. But it did get kept alive. And then here's another angle of this. The people that carried this out were not ashamed of what they did. They were frankly quite proud of it. And just like the postcards of the hangings, the postcards of the lynchings that were an art form in this country, people who went to the lynchings would want to get their picture taken standing next to the lynched body. Photographers would take pictures and turn them into postcards and do mass sales on them, documenting the crimes that they had carried out, not realizing that's what they were doing. This was something, this was what actually came down. That's where a lot of those pictures came from. It came from people who were documenting what for them was a joyous event, which again tells you something about the soul of this country that Joe Biden is going to work on. I mean, and that's his words. He's saying he's going to work on the soul of this country. To work on the soul of this country, you got to realize that that soul is foul, that that soul is evil, that it needs to get ripped out. That's the only way you can go to work on it. If you ain't going to work on it from that perspective, then you are working with it. You are perpetuating it. And that's Joe Biden. That's what he's doing. Now, I got a question or two here from the YouTube chat. Okay. Let's see. When Carl Dix refused the draft for Vietnam, was he affiliated with the National Black Anti-War, Anti-Draft Union or any other Black-led anti-draft movement? Or was this an independent act of resistance? Well, I mean, look, I wasn't with any organization at the time. I mean, I was a young Black man, grew up in the ghetto, trying to make a way out of very little way. I think I was going to night school, trying to like get a position, get a professional job, and make it. But I was also seeing what this country was doing to Black people here in this country. And I was getting glimpses of what it was doing in Vietnam. When I got drafted, I mean, I didn't want to go, but not because I knew the war was foul. It was just inconvenient because a lot of older people, brothers who had gone, didn't come back. Some of the ones who came back, you could tell they left their mind in Vietnam. They had been warped by being turned into mindless killers for this system. I'm like, I don't want to end up like that. But that wasn't enough for me to refuse to go into the Army. But then once I got in and I got the orders to go to Vietnam, I started talking to other brothers and especially the black GIs, some white GIs I was able to talk to too. There were sharp racial divisions in the US Army at that point. And some of them just laid it out to me. You go over to Vietnam, every Vietnamese person, you have to treat them as your enemy. Man, woman, and child. And I was like, I ain't gonna become that person. If you're gonna send me somewhere and say I got to kill every man, woman, and child, that's somewhere I ain't going. Because I wasn't me. I wasn't raised that way, but also I was becoming my own person, and I was not that person. And then that's why I refused to go to Vietnam. Now, it was an independent act of resistance, but it was also one that was influenced by the movement that had developed, the movement of resistance to what was happening to black people, and the movement of resistance to the Vietnam War. Because I remember hearing Stokely Carmichael say, ain't no black man got no good reason to go 10,000 miles across the water to kill yellow people for this white system. And I had to admit, that makes some sense. Why would I do that? Look at what this system is doing to black people. I remembered reading a copy of the Black Panther Party newspaper, and they said the enemy in Vietnam is the US government and its military. And the Vietnamese people, they're our allies in the struggle against imperialism. I didn't really understand what imperialism meant at the time, but I decided I better go to work on it. I should probably figure this out, because these brothers and sisters who were bold and brave and courageous were taking a stand. And I had to determine whether I should take that stand with them. So that's what led me to refusing to go to Vietnam. That's how it came down. Okay, there were a couple hands out, I thought. Okay, I only see one.
Well, I just want to question about war in the United States, man. I just want to say something about war within the United States. Ever since time, every war, we went fighting, we returned fighting. Even if we pull out the troops tomorrow from Afghanistan, look what the troops would have to come through today. So like W.E.G. Du Bois said, we went fighting, we returned fighting. It's sad. And if anything, Vietnam, if you know about the ancient society, it's called Angkor Wat. Angkor Wat. When they first seen a black man, they thought the Buddha gods come home. Because if you know anything about the temples of a Buddha, they was playing with the big long dread, with the braids and everything. But anyway, like you said, it's from imperialism and everything. Is sad. And all those people wanted to do was to live a life, man. We seen what it was. The French was in there before we were in there. It was sad. It seemed like history repeats itself. And when you have them people, when you have certain people in power, man, and telling our story or telling a story, they make history look like a mystery. And I came in when you was talking about insurrection. That's when I came in a few minutes ago. Well, I come from a group of people that took part in Stonewall. Yeah, that same church that don't know why he did what he did, why he chose that church. Because that was the church where Denmark Vesey and Gabriel Prosser did the Stonewall revolt. Yeah, my bloodline run through that church. And I'm glad that the Spirit brought me by here today. And like you said, man, 100 years since the Tulsa Massacre. And I remember the first time I heard about it, I had a teacher named Miss Robertson, man, and wow, man, it really stunk it. It really stuck it. And I think I come from a family who hold historically our story close to the bosom, but this Black Wall Street is something. And one last thing I want to say. You know what happened in Oklahoma? Oklahoma is called the Sooner State. The picture of a wagon train getting up with a horse. We was exempt from when they said Oklahoma land rush. We was exempt, but when we did get there, we made the best out of nothing. I mean, the greedy section called Black Wall Street. And let me tell you, at that time, the United States, that was the phrase, go west, young man, go west. Well, a lot of people did go west from the south, meaning other people. I may sound bitter, but I'm not bitter at everybody. I know everybody. But when other people went west, you know what they took with them? They southern attitude to Oklahoma. And that's what led to things on Wall Street. I can see it happening again. Look at January 7th. This man ran on a make America great again, make America hate again. They were a bunch of cowards. Do you know that Washington, D.C., the top surveyor, Benjamin Banneker, do you know we're talking about now? That's the most secured place in the world. You can shut it down. They let it happen. Innocent people got killed. Man. It was sad. It was sad.
Okay, I want to touch on a few things that the brother said. First off, he referred to the Stono Revolt in Charleston, and he's talking about uprisings by enslaved people back in the 1800s. One of them was led by Gabriel Prosser. Another one was led by Denmark Vesey. And that's where people got together, planned, and rose up to try to throw off slave chains. And an important thing to note about that, most of the people who were involved in that were enslaved people, but not all of them. Some of them were people who had been emancipated from slavery, had their freedom, but had not lost their connection to the people who were enslaved and felt that it was worth putting their lives on the line for that.
It sure wasn't the Blue Vein Society, if you know about them.
Yeah. Now, you also talked about the United States and war and this thing of going off to fight for this country and coming back and having to fight. And this is an important question that people have to take up and have to get into, because in too many oppressed households, not just black people, this is also very big in Mexican American communities, other Latino communities, there's this thing of, and it was especially big on the young men, it may have now spread to the young women. When I was coming up, they weren't taking very many women into the military, so it wasn't a big thing then. Go off into the military, it'll help make you a man. And then the other thing that was laid out way before that was that black people going off into the military and fighting for this country was a way to show that you deserved citizenship and equality. Let's look at the reality of this. Let's look at it. Because, look, going off into the military does not make you part of a bad organization that people should respect. This is something that's spoken to again in that declaration and call people to get organized now for a real revolution. What it makes you is part of a killing machine. It turns you into a mindless killer for this system. And do not expect to get any fucking benefits after you go and do it. Because when you come back to this system, you're a Dixie cup. You know what a Dixie cup, maybe people don't call it this anymore. Them little paper cups that are in the thing and you pull one out, get some water, you drink it. What do you do with the Dixie cup after you drink the water? You ball it up and you throw it away. That is how this system treats its military veterans. That's how it has historically treated its military veterans. And they might throw out some verbiage about, well, we got to thank our vets for their service. But what the vets actually get is greater levels of homelessness, greater levels of drug addiction, ending up in the military. And people need to get that and understand that and realize they being Dixie cupped and thrown away. And for what? To go around the world and help oppress and exploit other people, bring to them the savagery that's being brought down on you here? And then let me say this to our military veterans and everybody else, because they tell us to say thank you for your service. Well, I say fuck you for your service. And I say that because you were in service to an empire that was acting against the interest of humanity. You were carrying out missions that you should have wanted to be no part of. And I don't care if they've now worked it out so you can do some of it at long distance. Because when the brothers went over to Vietnam, I had a very good friend who went over. He was a little bit younger than me. He volunteered to go. He was part of the Marines. And he was really a sweet kid. He would have hated to hear me say that about him. But that's what he was. I mean, I had to protect him from the people who wanted to bully him. And I wasn't really not the fighting type. But I would protect him because he didn't deserve to be treated like that. So when he came back from from Vietnam, he seemed different. He seemed strange. He was always telling me about, they took my belt when I came back from the Nam. I really loved that belt. He said it so much, I said, come on, man, I will take you down to the Mart. That was the name of a department store in Baltimore. And I will buy you a belt so you can stop talking about it. And then he said, no, you don't understand. This belt was special. It had the ears of the people that I had killed on it. So that sweet kid who was a friend of mine, we used to call him Bunky. He had lost his mind over in Vietnam. He had become a mindless killer. That's what they turn you into. That's what you're becoming part of. Now, he did his shit right up close and personal. He could cut the ears off of the people he killed. Well, they might do it now where you can do it more long distance, more long range. You don't have to look the people in the eye as you kill them. But it's the same damn shit.
That's right.
You don't need to be a part of that. You shouldn't want to be a part of it. And that's why I say to veterans, fuck you for your service. Now, if you can come to me and say, well, wait a minute, Brother Dix, I did what you did when I was in the military, then I will say, okay, I'm sorry. You didn't serve the empire. You resisted the empire. You wouldn't stand with it. And I would thank you for that service. But if you went out and killed for this system, then you deserve a fuck you for your service. Oh, we got more. Maybe you should bring them up. Okay. I don't know what order they came in, but here's how I'm going to take them. What do you see in last summer's uprising and the situation that has developed since then that is promising for the development of the revolution you're arguing and building for? And look, when George Floyd was murdered and when the video that young sister Darnella Frazier took and spread around the world came out, people looked at that. They saw what the police do to Black people. And this was no extreme, unusual thing that was done. This is what police do to Black people. There was no argument over, does this shit happen or not? You just saw it happen. You watched it go down, and people flooded into the streets in Minneapolis. Just personally, I got a little bit of age on me. My wife has underlying conditions, so I needed to stay clear of the coronavirus. I had been in the house just about for months at that point, but I was like, okay, I got to go out there now. I got to be in the street with people saying this shit has got to end. When people took to the streets, they were calling for justice for George Floyd, but they were calling for more than that. They were calling for an end to murder by police. They were calling for an end to white supremacy. They were coming together, people of different races and nationalities, all different genders. and they were determined to see some fundamental change. Now, that movement that developed wasn't able to stay together, stay out in the streets. In fact, some of the people involved in it have siphoned themselves off or gotten siphoned off into arguing with Democrats over the budgets of the local police departments, which is not a way to get fundamental change, let me tell you. But there are millions of people in this country who wanted to see white supremacy ended, wanted to see murder by police ended, and those people have not gone away. They're still out there, and we need to connect with them a way to actually end white supremacy, a way to actually stop murder by police. And that way is revolution. And we need to connect to them. We need to get them connected to the leadership that we have for this in Bob Avakian, a man who throughout his life, as part of working on the emancipation of humanity, has been working for the liberation of Black people. Somebody who said, as a leader of a movement for revolution, that any revolutionary movement that develops in this country has to have as a foundational part of what it's out to do, ending the oppression of Black people. And if it ain't got that as part of its foundational effort, then it ain't worthy of the name revolution. This is who Avakian is. People need to get connected to that. And that's a task and a challenge that's before this movement for revolution, and one that people who want to get free need to throw themselves into taking up. So that's one of the questions. Another question, I guess I can speak to this one more quickly. Did RevCom have any affiliation with / thoughts on the Black Panther Party? Look, RevCom, the Revolutionary Communist Party, we are not affiliated with the Black Panther Party, but many of our veteran leaders and activists were greatly inspired by the Black Panther Party. You know, they were out selling the Red Book, and a lot of us, like a lot of other people actually our age, got their first Red Book from a Black Panther Party member. Our leader, Bob Avakian, actually did work closely with the Black Panther Party in the Bay Area in San Francisco back in its formative period. This is something that he speaks to quite a bit in his memoir, From Ike to Mao and Beyond. And you can learn a lot from the revolutionary movement and the struggle and the conditions back in that period, as well as learning a lot about the kind of man that Bob Avakian is and the kind of leader he is. And as far as thoughts on the Black Panther Party, the Black Panther Party was the most revolutionary force out there in its heyday, back in the late 60s into the 70s. And that's why many of us were inspired by them and why a lot of us worked with them in that period. They were not able to maintain because as they got out there, as they put revolution on the agenda here in the belly of the beast, as they and we used to call it back then, they got come down on with full feet by this system before they had worked out a lot of what was needed in terms of an understanding of the system and the way that it worked, the strategy for making revolution, and a vision of the society to bring into being. So they were right up against it and not able to do that and not able to maintain. But an important part of their legacy are revolutionaries and, in fact, the movement for an actual revolution that they provided inspiration for. I got one more question, but I'll go back to the audience, and then I'll get this one after that.
It's good to be here with folks tonight, and just want to appreciate the comments that my man Dave made previously. But it's important as we gather here to have a real understanding of perspective in history. Because I don't know who said it, but you know, if you don't learn from mistakes of the past, you're doomed to repeat them. So when we think about the 100-year gap between May 31st, 1921 and January 6th, 2021, the whitewashing of Tulsa, Oklahoma is underway in 2021 because the effort to have a bipartisan committee to ferret out what took place has been quashed by the Trumplican Party. And it's been done without real protests from the Democrats. So the whitewashing of January 6th, which was insurrection, and there was a white supremacist undertone to it, it's in motion. And what we have to learn from that is that a tiger can't change his stripes. And, you know, that now points to learning from the past, because if you're going to bring about change, there are limitations to protest, street protests. From Dr. King to Black Lives Matter to hip hop, people have been protesting for 60, 70 years, and yet we find ourselves in the same situation. Black men being murdered, unemployment rates high, lack of real entrepreneurial opportunities for people in communities, disparity in wealth, unfair taxation, and all of this exists after 60, 70 years of protest. So what I would suggest is that as this organization moves forward, I'm not saying don't protest, but understand the limitations of it. So what is the right way to bring about the change that we all desire? And that starts with, Carl, I heard you say a number of times, you know, a vision for the future. Well, there has to be a vision for a future and a game plan on how to get there. And I don't want to take up too much time, but I did want to draw the parallel between 1921 and what is taking place in front of our own eyes, the whitewashing of January 6th by white supremacist fascists. And the good thing about now, as opposed to the 107-year-old woman who testified before Congress, is that we're in a position to do something. You know, we can stop this. You know, we can make sure that this is documented and is understood who executed it and what their missions were. More importantly, the members of Congress who helped them execute it. But by the same token, if we're going to bring about change over the next 40 years or 30 years, then it has to be using strategies and tactics that only include some small part of protest, street protest, because there's empirical evidence that it doesn't work, and there has to be an outside the box approach, a fresh way of looking at the problems and developing solutions that will be lasting. And save that discussion for another day.
Okay. Thank you for those remarks. And interestingly enough, I said I had a question from the live stream. That question is, what will it take to force the system to make the fascists account for the crimes of January 6, 2021? Because it is a dress rehearsal for another fascist attack. So you and this questioner were thinking along some same lines there. And look, important what you both said. This was a fascist assault. That's exactly what it was. These were people who were unleashed, called to DC, and prepared to try to overturn the results of the election that the Trump-Pence regime had lost. That is like out in the open. You know, Trump had a Twitter feed then. He was tweeting, come to DC on January 6th. It will be wild. You get to DC on January 6th and he tells you, you got to fight like you've never fought before or you won't have a country. He got people like Adolf Giuliani And I know what his actual name is, but I'm telling you his real name. Because he's been a fascist since before he was mayor of New York. And anybody who wants to talk about what happened to Giuliani, how did he change from the point that he was America's mayor? He's still America's mayor. He was a fascist then and he's one now. And if you were here in New York and you had your eyes open, you saw that. He got up there and said, we got to have a trial by combat. All of this is right out in the open. But then to get Congress to have a bipartisan commission to investigate this, you got to have the parties, or at least some section of both parties, come together to do that. And you got it sitting down. It's like the fascists is sitting over here. The regular imperialist politicians are sitting over there. The imperialist politicians say, let's have a commission to investigate that. And the fascists say, fuck no. And a few of them go out and vote for it, secure in the knowledge that it ain't going to go. And then the Democrats be like, well, we tried. What could we do? See, and that's like setting up with the slave masters and the Confederate generals over here, and then the people who oppose slavery over here saying, can we get a bipartisan ruling to carry forward in what we did to end slavery, to go to things like seeing to it that the formerly enslaved people have ways to survive and thrive, get land, because 40 acres and a mule, interestingly enough, I mean, I first heard about it through Spike Lee's stuff, but then I dug into it. It was actually legislation in Congress in the 1860s calling for 40 acres and a mule. But there were too many people in Congress who were themselves so imbued with white supremacy. They wasn't going to see that happen. No way we can do that. And it got beat down. You cannot get a bipartisan effort in this country at this point to dig into the crimes of the fascists. And what that does mean is that anybody who really wants to see that happen has to mount an effort that is not confined to the channels of the system to do it. You got to bring this stuff out in the open. You got to see to it that people are aware of it. And you got to do this because that fascist movement didn't go anywhere. You can see that by the way they scuttled the idea of the commission. You can see that by the laws that are being proposed and passed in dozens of states around the country to attack voting rights. You can see that in laws that are being proposed and passed to criminalize protest and to decriminalize running over protesters with your car. So it's like you want to get out there and protest police getting away with murder. You want to get out there and protest, pipelines that destroy areas that are significant to the culture of indigenous people and that are destroying the environment of the planet that we live on. They got laws against that. They got laws that say 3 people get together to do that, we can call that a riot. But if people get out and march and protest and somebody from whatever perspective they're coming from wants to run their car through that crowd of people, well, that's not a crime. No, I mean, that's what's being put forward. And this is something that has to be exposed, has to be gone at. And in saying that, I ain't saying get behind the Democrats and try to push them to do what needs to be done, because I understand that while they oppose the plan that the Republicans have for keeping, the Republic-Fascists have for keeping the system in effect, what they oppose it with is their own plan for what's the best way to keep America's global empire and its worldwide domination and effect. They're not opposing it from the interest of the people. They're opposing it because they think it's not the best way to keep the system in effect. And if you put your bets on them, at a certain point, as happened in Germany and other countries, the people who opposed the capitalist representatives who opposed the fascists can decide that, well, fascism ain't that bad. It could be worse. We could have a revolution, and they might abandon you and leave you in the lurch. So you can't rely on that shit. Okay. Take Vanessa and then Emma.
So, in terms of what you were speaking about how people get, swayed back into the democratic process of like, oh, the Democrats working towards bills. I wanted to speak a little about that because I've definitely noticed, especially like last year, a lot of, leaders of particular or organizers of particular events would use the edgy connotation of the word revolution, and then they would introduce a Democratic candidate right after that. And so I was just like, wait, hold up, wait, no, that's marketing. So how can we take that impetus that arises in a person, just like in them, and at the same time we've been out in the streets, handing out flyers and talking about revolution, and take the intrigue and curiosity of people who are interested in this and then transform it towards a path of actual revolution, while at the same time keeping tabs on these interested individuals, so that way they don't get persuaded back into like the June 22nd primary that's coming up. And then all of a sudden, they get brainwashed all over again, re-indoctrinated. Oh my God, let's go after this candidate. And then next thing you know, they're like, no, let's wait and see what they do. And then months pass. Like, how can we stop that right here, right now, in terms of Rev Club? I know you might not have an immediate answer, but
Okay. I mean, look, that's a problem that the revolution is up against, because there's always a pull, and you always have these representatives of the system who gauge how radical they need to sound in order to try to draw people out of the streets and back under the wing of this system, and to neutralize them in relation to being in position to do anything about what the system brings down. And what we have to do is we have to struggle with people. We have to get uncomfortable with some people sometimes, a lot of times. No, because we can't allow people who have glimpsed a part of the picture, and because of that are attracted to the revolution, but because they haven't yet gotten enough of the picture to get pulled back under the wing of this system. We got to actually work to broaden their sights, get them to see the reality, bring to them some of this history, get them to actually confront that reality, get them to deal with the history of Tulsa, deal with the history of massacres, deal with the history of resistance and the way in which the system has crushed it, co-opted it, and then at a later point snatched back the crumbs that were tossed out as part of co-optation. We got to bring that to people, and we got to struggle with them that now is a time when we got to be for real. We got to be serious about what's the source of the problem. We got to be serious about what's a way to really get out from under this problem, and be serious about the terms of things today and the struggle that's going on at the top of this system, the danger that it presents in terms of the fascist movement not having gone anywhere, in terms of the people at the top of the system who are fighting the fascists, working to keep in effect the system that's responsible for the problems that we're up against. And we got to struggle with people around that and bring to them that things don't have to be this way. That through revolution, we could end this, and bring to them and struggle with them that they got to get with this leader that we have for this movement for revolution in Bob Avakian, and take up things that they may not want to get into. You know, they may be like, you want me to follow an old white man? How could I do that? And again,
Well, we voted for Biden, didn't we?
yeah. See, that's the thing. That's the thing. A lot of people who have followed a lot of old white men and some old black men and women, frankly, who represent for the system. Then when you talk about let's get rid of this system, then they're like, I can't get behind a white man. I got to go and it's a city council meeting. I got to go down there and see if I could get the budget changed for the police department. Joe Biden's coming to town. I got to go. This is going to be important. Kamala Harris is coming to town. You know, and see, when people are speaking for this system, it don't matter who they are. They're not speaking for you. They're not representing your interest. And when you're evaluating Bob Avakian, you got to evaluate the work that he's done, the leadership that he's given, and seriously look at that, compare it to the reality that we face, the obstacles that we're up against, and the way that he is leading in terms of dealing with that, transforming that reality, overcoming those obstacles, and get serious and scientific about, is this the way out of this mess? Okay, we got somebody out there. That looks like Emma.
It's me. I was trying to disguise myself, but you caught me. Just kidding. Well, I just wanted to speak to this question that you were raising about like protests, because it's a question like we've been out in like the projects in the neighborhoods, and this is a big question, I think. And I think one thing is that I don't think we'd even be here talking about Tulsa if it wasn't for people rising up last summer. It didn't end police murder, but I'm telling you, they've had to do. Biden would not have gone to Tulsa. He's the first president that ever went there. Why? Because there was an uprising that happened, and they've had to quell it. So I just think that it's important to sort of recognize the difference it does make when people stand up, and when people lit up the sky and said, "We're not going to accept you killing us." It actually awoke all of society. But it did not, in and of itself, put an end to white supremacy. Why? Because of the system. We need a revolution. And a revolution is not just protest. That's the thing, is it's the overthrow, the dismantling of the military, the dismantling of the police. That's what a revolution is. And that's what this revolution is working towards and working to do. And I think that this question of like, protest, looking at actually the difference it makes when people stand up. But one of the problems for the revolution, and I mean, to do what we're talking about, very serious, we're not talking about just a big protest. We're talking about a revolution, an overthrow. That's going to take millions of people. And right now, the people who need to make this revolution feel encircled. They feel hopeless. They don't see their own power in making that revolution. And part of the June 12th going and making this demonstration and this declaration is not to protest and ask the police to act differently. It's to actually change the people who don't see their own power to see that they have power, and that we have power together to actually go and get the others. So I guess I just wanted to say that point of that. On one sense, I agree that protests in and of itself has not been enough. But that's why we need a revolution. And what role does people standing up and not taking this anymore actually play in awakening the millions who need to make this revolution? So,
Okay, let the brother come back on that. Then
I'm going to be very, very quick. Now, I'm going to be sensitive to women, but I'm going to use this illustration to make the point. Protesting and appealing to the better angels of the nature of the people who have oppressed Black people for 450 years is akin to a woman who's abused by a man. So he beats her, bop, bop. And her mother and her sister say, honey, why don't you leave that man alone because he doesn't like you? And she's holding a stake over her black eye, say, well, one day he's going to change. He's going to love me. And to an extent, it's not one-for-one correlation, but to an extent, appealing to these people who have never shown a disposition that would support that they would work with black people, appealing to them is like an abused woman. And you can't make them change. The only person that you can change is yourself. So the focus has to be on, in this 21st century, how do I change my behavior, my thinking, so that I begin to fix my circumstance? Now that requires a certain amount of outside the box thinking. And I'm not totally throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But what I am suggesting is that in order to foment the kind of change that people are talking about here, it's really going to require some outside the box thinking. And that also means learning from lessons in the past, figuring out what worked, what didn't work, and how can you synthesize things that have happened so that you can bring about the kind of change you're talking about.
Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I am going to take the fact that I got this mic up here and have some last words, unless there's something from Revolution Books that y'all want to say.
Yeah, after you.
Okay, why don't you say it? Yeah, right now, right now. I think the mic is out there.
All right, so I just again want to thank everyone for coming out to tonight's program. You have experienced Carl Dix, you have experienced Revolution Books, and this is what happens at the bookstore about the world for a radically different world. There's no place like it. And we count on your support, your involvement, your creative energy. This is an all-volunteer nonprofit bookstore. I'm calling on you, I'm inviting you, I am challenging you to donate to Revolution Books, to become a sustainer of Revolution Books. There are people from the staff. Jane is here, Brenda is here. Turn around, talk with them, make a donation. This bookstore is, as I said, the political, intellectual, and cultural center for a movement for an actual revolution. And we got into that tonight. And we get into that deeply at this bookstore. And that brings me to my next point, which is that this Friday, we are kicking off a discussion series of basics. Jane is waving the book. Basics from the talks and writings of Bob Avakian. This is the manual for revolution, for understanding and changing the world, to make that revolution, to overthrow the system, to change everything. This Friday, we're kicking off the discussion series, Talk with Jane. If you'd like to become part of it, we're going to dig into, and wrestle with this book. You are all invited. So again, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I want to call on you to donate to this bookstore, because it don't exist without your support. And it is urgent now for all the reasons that Carl has been addressing in his talk. This bookstore is an indispensable resource for the revolution. So I just wanted to say that, invite you all to Friday night's discussion of Basics, Talk with Jane. And I'm going to hand it back to Carl for the last word.
Okay, and look, here's what I want to do. I don't need that mic. I think I got one here. I want to move us to a different phase, and that is, I'm going to end the formal part of the program as soon as I say a couple of things. But you ain't got to go home. We can stay and have informal discussion, kick some stuff around, get deeper into some things. The one thing I wanted to say is we can actually influence and help to change more than ourselves. And I say that from looking at my own experience. I mean, I made some changes. I went to from somebody who felt the Vietnam War was inconvenient, but would go along with it if they gave me orders to go, to somebody who would say, take me to jail then, because I ain't fighting in your fucking war. I had to make that decision myself, but part of what helped me to make that decision was what some other people did. You know, what the Black Panther Party did, what SNCC and Stokely Carmichael and people like that did, what the anti-war movement did, and what some of the GIs who told me about Vietnam did, even though some of them did not realize they were influencing me in the direction to oppose it. Because some of them weren't saying, this was horrible, man, we had to do this and that and the other. They were just reporting what had happened. But that influenced me, that helped me to change. Then there was also the fact that there was some bad sisters and brothers. Out on the West Coast, there was the Black Panther Party. On the East Coast, there was the Young Lords Party. I still remember seeing the Lords marching down the street in New York City in uniform, throwing down against this system. And that activity helped to change the way I looked at things. It opened up to me the possibility of making fundamental change. And it got me to be digging into and looking at the revolution. And then I end up in Leavenworth, and I'm in solitary confinement because that's where I spent most of my time in Leavenworth. They felt I was doing things that were detrimental to the order of the prison. I mean, they were right. I had just hoped they wouldn't figure out it was me. But they caught me. So I spent most of my time in solitary, which meant I was able to do a lot of studying because that's about all I could do. Figured out how to get literature in that I could do some study of. We can maybe talk about that in the informal part. But so we have to set our sights not just on changing ourselves. We have to look at what are the ways that we can come together and act to help change the way other people think. We have to bring to them things that they might not see, like the possibility of revolution, like the need for revolution. We have to bring to them the leadership we have for this revolution, which far too few people know about. This is a challenge that's before us, and it is a mission that I call on everybody who wants to get free to take up. So now we're going to move into the unofficial part of the informal part, I guess. And thank everybody for coming out like late.